You think you know loyalty. You think you understand family. Well, let me tell you something right now that's going to make your blood boil and your head spin, because what's happening with Jey Uso is not just a wrestling storyline anymore. This is a man being psychologically destroyed in front of millions of people every single week. And, the worst part, everyone's just sitting back and watching it happen like it's entertainment. Roman Reigns has crossed every line imaginable, and Jey Uso is caught in a nightmare that he can't escape from, no matter how hard he tries. And before you tell me this is all scripted, before you tell me it's just a show, let me ask you this. When does acting stop and real manipulation begin? When does a storyline become actual emotional abuse? Because what we're witnessing right now isn't just compelling television. It's a masterclass in how one person can systematically break down another human being's sense of self-worth, identity, and independence. And the fact that WWE is packaging this as entertainment, that fans are cheering for it, that nobody seems to care about the psychological warfare being waged on this man, that should make every single one of us uncomfortable. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into the loyalty crisis that's consuming Jey Uso. And I guarantee by the end of this, you're going to see this whole situation in a completely different light. Let's start from the beginning, because context matters here. Jey Uso wasn't always the broken, conflicted, tortured soul we see stumbling around on SmackDown every week. This was a man who had it all figured out. He was one half of the greatest tag team in WWE history. He and his brother Jimmy dominated the tag team division for years, collecting championships like they were going out of style. They had respect, they had success, they had their own identity separate from anyone else. They were the USOs, and that meant something. They didn't need Roman Reigns. They didn't need the tribal chief. They were perfectly fine carving out their own legacy and building their own empire. But then Roman came back, and everything changed. He didn't just come back as a wrestler. He came back as this all-consuming force that demanded absolute submission from everyone around him, especially his family. And that's where this nightmare began for Jey. Roman Reigns positioned himself as the head of the table, the tribal chief, the undisputed leader of the bloodline. And with that self-appointed title came expectations. He expected loyalty. He expected obedience. He expected everyone in his family to fall in line and acknowledge him as their superior. For Jimmy, this was easier to navigate. He had his own reservations, his own doubts, but he could compartmentalize. He could play the game while maintaining some sense of self. But Jey was different. Jey was emotional, passionate, proud. He didn't want to bow down to anyone, especially not his own cousin, who he'd known his entire life. He wanted to prove that he was an equal, that he deserved respect on his own merits, that he didn't need to ride anyone's coattails. And Roman absolutely could not tolerate that kind of independence. So, what did he do? He systematically broke Jey down, piece by piece, week after week, until there was nothing left of the man Jey used to be. The Hell in a Cell match between Roman and Jey was where we first saw the true extent of Roman's psychological manipulation. This wasn't just a match. This was public humiliation designed to strip Jey of his dignity. Roman didn't just beat him, he destroyed him, while Jimmy was forced to watch helplessly from ringside. And when it was over, when Jey was lying broken and defeated in the middle of the ring, Roman didn't extend a hand in respect. He demanded submission. He made it clear that the only way Jey would have a place in this family was if he completely surrendered his will and accepted Roman as his superior. And Jey, in one of the most heartbreaking moments in recent wrestling history, had no choice but to comply. He was beaten, battered, and emotionally shattered. What else could he do? Refuse and be cast out of his own family? Stand on principle and lose everything he'd ever known? The choice wasn't really a choice at all. From that moment forward, Jey Uso has been living in hell. He's caught between his loyalty to his family and his own sense of self. Every week on SmackDown we watch him struggle with this impossible position. Roman treats him like a servant, barking orders and expecting immediate compliance. When Jey doesn't move fast enough, when he questions a decision, when he shows even the slightest hint of independent thought, Roman punishes him. Sometimes it's verbal abuse disguised as tough love. Sometimes it's physical intimidation. Sometimes it's just that look, that cold, calculating stare that says without words that Jey is expendable, that he can be replaced, that his value exists only in his usefulness to the tribal chief. And Jey takes it. He swallows his pride. He bites his tongue. He does what he's told because he's been conditioned to believe that this is what family looks like, that this is the price of belonging. But here's where things get really twisted. Roman doesn't just want Jey's obedience. He wants his soul. He wants Jey to genuinely believe that serving the tribal chief is the highest honor he could achieve. He wants to erase every trace of Jey's independent identity and replace it with blind devotion. And the scary thing is, it's working. Watch Jey's eyes during segments with Roman. Watch the way he second-guesses himself. The way he seeks approval, like a child looking for validation from a parent. Watch how he's internalized Roman's messaging to the point where he actually defends Roman's actions even when they're indefensible. That's not acting. That's a person who's been psychologically conditioned to accept abuse as love, control as protection, Manipulation as leadership. The relationship between Jay and Jimmy adds another layer of tragedy to this whole mess. These brothers, who used to be inseparable, who built their careers together, who had each other's backs through everything, are now on completely different wavelengths. Jimmy can see what's happening to Jay. He can see how Roman's influence is poisoning his brother's mind and destroying his spirit. But every time Jimmy tries to intervene, every time he tries to pull Jay away from Roman's grip, Jay resists. He's so deep in Roman's web that he can't see the manipulation anymore. He genuinely believes that Roman has his best interests at heart, that the bloodline is the most important thing, that loyalty to the tribal chief supersedes everything else, including his own well-being, and that breaks Jimmy's heart. Imagine watching your own brother, your twin, your other half, slowly lose himself to someone else's control and being completely powerless to stop it. The psychological tactics Roman uses on JR textbook manipulation strategies, and it's disturbing how effectively he deploys them. First, there's isolation. Roman has systematically separated Jay from anyone who might challenge his authority or offer Jay alternative perspectives. When other wrestlers try to reach out to Jay, Roman shuts it down. When Jimmy tries to have real conversations with his brother, Roman interferes. Jay's entire world has been narrowed down to the bloodline, and within that structure, Roman is the sun around which everything revolves. Second, there's intermittent reinforcement. Roman doesn't abuse Jay constantly. Sometimes he praises him, gives him moments of recognition, makes him feel valued. These brief moments of approval are like water in a desert for Jay, and they make him more desperate to please Roman, more willing to endure the bad times in hopes of earning another crumb of validation. Third, there's gap. Roman constantly rewrites history and reframes situations to make Jay doubt his own perceptions. When Jay questions a decision, Roman acts like Jay is being unreasonable or disloyal. When Jay expresses discomfort with something Roman has done, Roman twists it around to make Jay feel guilty for not being supportive enough. Over time, this erodes Jay's confidence in his own judgment and makes him more dependent on Roman's version of reality. Fourth, there's the threat of abandonment. Roman has made it crystal clear that Jay's place in the family is conditional. If Jay doesn't comply, if he doesn't submit, if he doesn't acknowledge Roman's authority, then he's out. And for someone like Jay, whose entire identity is wrapped up in family and belonging, that threat is more terrifying than any physical punishment could ever be. The recent developments have taken this situation to even darker places. Roman has started using Jay as a weapon, sending him to do his dirty work, forcing him to make choices that compromise Jay's own values and relationships. When Roman orders Jay to attack someone, Jay does it, even when every fiber of his being is screaming at him to refuse. When Roman demands that Jay prove his loyalty through increasingly degrading tasks, Jay complies because he's been conditioned to believe that hesitation equals betrayal. And the worst part is that Roman frames all of this as being for Jay's own good. He tells Jay that he's making him stronger, that he's preparing him for leadership, that all of this suffering has purpose and meaning. It's a lie, of course. Roman doesn't want Jay to become a leader. He wants Jay to remain a follower. But Jay is so deep in the fog of manipulation that he can't see the truth anymore. The fan reaction to all of this has been complicated and frankly pretty disturbing in its own right. A significant portion of the audience treats this as pure entertainment, cheering for Roman's dominance and viewing Jay as weak for not standing up for himself. These fans don't seem to grasp that what they're watching is a portrayal of psychological abuse, that the reason Jay can't just leave or just fight back is because he's been systematically broken down to the point where those options don't even register as possibilities in his mind anymore. Other fans recognize the darkness of what's happening but are conflicted. Because they enjoy Roman's heel work and appreciate the storytelling, they can acknowledge that Roman's character is doing horrible things while still being entertained by the performance. And then there are fans who are genuinely disturbed by this storyline, who feel uncomfortable watching it play out, who worry about what message it sends to viewers who might be experiencing similar dynamics in their own lives. Asterisk. What's particularly insidious about this storyline is how it mirrors real-world abusive relationships and family dynamics. Everything Roman does to Jay is pulled straight from the abuser's playbook. The isolation, the degradation, the intermittent affection, the rewriting of reality, the threats of abandonment, the erosion of self-worth. It's all there. And for viewers who have experienced these dynamics in their own lives, watching this play out on television can be genuinely triggering. WWE is playing with fire here, using psychological abuse as entertainment without seemingly understanding or caring about the impact that might have. They're not framing this as a cautionary tale or using it to shine a light on these issues. They're just exploiting the emotional intensity of abuse. Dynamics for ratings and reactions. The question everyone keeps asking is, when will Jay finally break free? When will he have his moment of clarity where he realizes what's been done to him and finds the strength to reclaim his independence? And honestly, that's the wrong question because it fundamentally misunderstands how this kind of manipulation works. People don't just wake up one day and decide to leave abusive situations. It's a process. It's messy. It's non-linear. They might have moments of recognition followed by regression. They might try to leave and get pulled back in. They might rationalize and justify and make excuses for their abuser because accepting the truth is too painful. If WWE is serious about telling this story with any kind of authenticity or depth, Jay's eventual liberation, if it comes at all, needs to be earned through that kind of realistic psychological journey. Asterisk. But here's what really makes my blood boil about this whole situation. Roman Reigns is being booked as the most dominant, most successful, most celebrated wrestler in the company. He's main eventing pay-per-views. He's breaking records. He's being positioned as the face of WWE. And all of that success is built on the backs of people he's manipulating and controlling. The message being sent is that this kind of behavior works. That dominating and degrading the people around you is an effective path to greatness. That loyalty extracted through fear and manipulation is just as valid as loyalty earned through respect and genuine care. That's a dangerous message, and it's one that WWE seems completely oblivious to or unconcerned about as long as Roman continues to draw ratings and move merchandise. Asterisk. Let's talk about Jimmy's role in all of this because his position is almost as tragic as Jay's, just in a different way. Jimmy has been forced to watch his brother's slow-motion destruction while being powerless to stop it. He's tried reason, he's tried emotion, he's tried direct confrontation. Nothing works. Jay is too far gone, too thoroughly convinced that Roman's way is the only way, and now Jimmy is faced with an impossible choice. Does he continue trying to save Jay, knowing that every attempt drives a bigger wedge between them? Does he join the bloodline himself to stay close to his brother, even though that means enabling the very dynamic that's destroying Jay? Or does he walk away entirely, accept that he's lost his brother, and try to rebuild his own life, separate from this toxicity? There's no good answer. Every option involves loss and pain and compromise. Asterisk. The bloodline as a whole has become this twisted family structure, where everyone's value is determined solely by their usefulness to Roman. Solo Sikoa is the enforcer, the muscle who does Roman's violent bidding without question. Paul Heyman is the advocate, the mouthpiece who validates Roman's delusions of grandeur and helps him maintain his grip on power. And Jay and Jimmy are supposed to be the loyal soldiers, the ones who execute Roman's will without hesitation or complaint. But unlike Solo, who seems genuinely comfortable in his role, and unlike Paul, who benefits materially from his association with Roman, Jay is miserable. You can see it in every interaction, every segment, every match. He's going through the motions of loyalty while dying inside, and nobody in the bloodline seems to notice or care as long as he continues to perform his function. Asterisk. There have been moments, brief glimmers, where it seemed like Jay might be on the verge of breaking free. Times when Roman pushed too far, when Jay's face showed a flash of anger or recognition, when it looked like he might finally say, enough is enough. But every single time, something pulls him back in. Sometimes it's Roman's manipulation, a perfectly timed gesture of approval or inclusion that makes Jay question his doubts. Sometimes it's Jay's own fear of being alone, of losing his family, of having his identity completely shattered. Sometimes it's external circumstances that force Jay back into line before he can fully process his feelings. These false starts are actually realistic in terms of how abusive dynamics work, but they're also deeply frustrating to watch because they extend Jay's suffering indefinitely. Asterisk. The physical toll this is taking on Jay is obvious to anyone paying attention. He looks exhausted, worn down, older than he should. The constant stress, the emotional turmoil, the psychological warfare, it's all manifesting physically. His in-ring performance has suffered at times because it's hard to perform at your best when your mind is constantly in crisis mode. His promos have this haunted quality where you can hear the internal conflict bleeding through every word. This isn't just a character going through a storyline. This is a performer bringing genuine emotional depth to a portrayal of someone being systematically destroyed. And credit to Jey Uso, the person, for committing so fully to this story. But at what cost? How much of himself is he putting into this performance? And what happens when the cameras stop rolling? Asterisk. Social media has become a battleground over this storyline, with fans taking wildly different positions on what it all means and whether it's good television. Some fans praise WWE for telling a complex, layered story about family dynamics and psychological manipulation. They argue that wrestling should tackle difficult subjects and that this storyline is doing important work by showing the reality of abusive relationships. Other fans are deeply critical, arguing that WWE is exploiting serious issues for entertainment value, without any real intention of addressing them meaningfully or providing resolution. They point out that there's no educational component, no resources provided for viewers who might be experiencing similar situations, no acknowledgement from WWE that what they're depicting is problematic behavior rather than just heel tactics. Asterisk. Then there are the fans who don't engage with the psychological depth at all and just view this as another wrestling angle with a good guy and a bad guy and eventual comeuppance. These fans get frustrated when people analyze the storyline through the lens of abuse dynamics because they feel it's taking wrestling too seriously or reading too much into what's meant to be simple entertainment. But here's the thing. WWE made the choice to tell this particular story in this particular way. They decided to base Roman's character on psychological manipulation rather than just physical dominance. They chose to show Jay's deterioration in such explicit detail. You can't tell a story that closely mimics real abuse dynamics and then act surprised when people respond to it as such. Asterisk. The broader implications of this storyline for WWE's product and culture are worth examining too. This isn't happening in isolation. Roman's reign of dominance has been going on for years, now with no end in sight. The entire main event scene on SmackDown revolves around him and his whims. Other wrestlers' storylines and characters exist, primarily in relation to whether they acknowledge the tribal chief or challenge his authority. This creates a stagnant, claustrophobic atmosphere where the same power dynamics play out over and over with slight variations. And Jay's situation is the most extreme example of how this dynamic crushes individual wrestlers' identities and agency in service of maintaining Roman's position at the center of everything. What happens when this storyline finally ends? Whenever and however that might be. Let's say Jay does eventually break free from Roman's control. Then what? How do you rebuild a character who's been so thoroughly broken down? How do you restore credibility and strength to someone who's been positioned as weak and submissive for years? And what about the relationship between Jay and Jimmy? Can that ever be fully repaired after everything that's happened? These aren't questions WWE seems to be considering in their long-term planning, or if they are considering them, they're gambling that the audience won't care about the aftermath. As long as the moment of liberation gets a big pop, there's also the question of accountability. If and when Jay breaks free, what consequences will Roman face for his actions? In real life, there should be serious repercussions for treating someone the way Roman has treated Jay. But this is wrestling, where heels often get away with terrible behavior until they finally lose a big match and then everything is forgiven. Will that be enough? Will a pinfall loss adequately address years of psychological abuse? Or will WWE just move on to the next storyline without ever really grappling with what they've depicted? The lack of accountability would send a message that this kind of behavior is ultimately acceptable as long as you're powerful enough to get away with it. Let's talk about Paul Heyman's role in enabling all of this because he doesn't get nearly enough scrutiny. For his part in Jay's destruction, Paul is presented as the wise counsel, the strategic advisor, but in reality, he's a co-conspirator in Roman's manipulation schemes. He reinforces Roman's delusions. He helps isolate Jay from other influences. He provides intellectual justification for Roman's worst impulses. Paul is like the family member who knows abuse is happening but looks the other way because confronting it would jeopardize their own position. His hands are just as dirty as Roman's, but he hides behind his role as advocate and pretends he's just doing his job. The tribal chief persona itself is worth deconstructing because it's the foundation for everything that's happened to Jay. Has taken legitimate cultural elements from his Samoan heritage and weaponized them to justify his control over his family. He's twisted the concept of traditional family structure and respect for elders into something toxic and authoritarian. And this is particularly problematic because it perpetuates stereotypes about Pacific Islander cultures being inherently patriarchal and hierarchical in oppressive ways. Real Samoan family structures, while they do emphasize respect and interconnectedness, also value consensus and collective well-being. Roman's version is a distortion that serves his character's need for absolute power. The breaking point has to come eventually. Right, Jay can't sustain this level of internal conflict indefinitely. Something has to give. Either he completely loses himself and becomes a hollow shell going through the motions with no independent thought left, or he finds something inside himself that Roman hasn't been able to touch. Some core of self that survives the manipulation and gives him the strength to reclaim his identity. The most powerful version of this story would be if Jay's liberation comes not from external rescue, but from internal realization. If he saves himself rather than being saved by Jimmy or another wrestler, if he finds his own voice again and uses it to reject Roman's authority, that would be satisfying storytelling and would honor everything Jay has endured. But I'm not confident that's the direction WWE is heading. They've shown repeatedly that they're more interested in shocking moments than thoughtful character work, more focused on maintaining Roman's dominance than telling complete stories for the other characters in his orbit. Jay's suffering might just be endless because it serves the larger narrative of the tribal chief's reign, and that would be a tragedy, not just in storytelling terms but in terms of what it says about WWE's values and priorities. They'd be sacrificing a character's integrity and a performer's years of emotional investment for the sake of keeping one guy on top indefinitely. The audience is hungry for resolution. You can feel it in the crowd reactions, in the social media discussions, in the way people engage with this storyline. They want Jay to be free. They want him to stand up to Roman. They want the satisfaction of seeing this abuse cycle broken and justice served. But WWE keeps teasing that resolution without delivering it. And every false start, every time Jay gets close to breaking free only to be pulled back in, chips away at audience investment. There's only so many times you can pull the football away before people stop trying to kick it. At some point, if WWE doesn't follow through on the promise of Jay's liberation, fans will give up on the storyline entirely out of frustration. What we're watching with Jey Uso is a man in crisis, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, between family and individuality, between who he was and who he's been forced to become. Roman Reigns has systematically broken him down through manipulation, intimidation, and psychological warfare. The bloodline has become a prison dressed up as a family. And every week that this continues, every segment where Jay swallows his pride and submits to Roman's will, we're watching a tragedy unfold in real time. This isn't just a wrestling angle. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating effects of psychological abuse. Jey Uso deserves better than this. The character deserves a meaningful resolution, and the performer deserves recognition for the emotional depth he's brought to this role. But most importantly, this story needs to matter. It needs to lead somewhere purposeful rather than just being endless suffering for its own sake. The loyalty crisis consuming Jey Uso needs to end with his liberation and reclamation of self, where everything we've watched has been exploitation masquerading as entertainment. And that should make all of us angry enough to demand better, not just for Jay, but for every character and performer trapped in cycles of abuse and manipulation for the sake of someone else's glory. So let me know in the comments where you think this is all heading. Because this conversation is far from over, and Jay's fate is still hanging in the balance.